Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to c4. Knight g8 to f6. Knight f3 to g5. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Knight c6 to a5. Bishop c4 to b5, check. Pawn c7 to c6. Pawn d5 takes c6. Pawn b7 takes c6. Bishop b5 to e2. Pawn h7 to h6. Knight g5 to f3. Pawn e5 to e4. Knight f3 to e5. Queen d8 to d5. Pawn f2 to f4. Bishop c8 to e6. Pawn b2 to b3. Bishop f8 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight a5 to b7. Pawn b3 to b4. Bishop c5 to b6. Queen d1 to a4. Knight b7 to d8. Bishop c1 to b2. Bishop e6 to f5. Pawn c3 to c4. Queen d5 to e6. Pawn c4 to c5. Bishop b6 to c7. Bishop e2 to c4. Queen e6 to c8. Knight e5 takes c6. Bishop f5 to d7. Pawn b4 to b5. Pawn a7 to a6. Knight c6 takes d8. Pawn a6 takes b5. Bishop c4 takes f7, check. King e8 to f8. Queen a4 to b4. Queen c8 takes d8. Bishop f7 to b3. Bishop c7 to a5. Queen b4 to d4. Rook a8 to c8. Castle kingside. Queen d8 to e7. Rook f1 to c1. Rook c8 to c6. Queen d4 to e5. Bishop a5 to c7. Queen e5 takes e7, check. King f8 takes e7. Pawn a2 to a4. Pawn b5 to b4. Bishop b2 to d4. Bishop c7 takes f4. Rook c1 to c4. Bishop d7 to e6. Bishop d4 takes f6, check. Pawn g7 takes f6. Rook c4 takes e4. Bishop f4 to e5. Pawn d2 to d4. Bishop e6 takes b3. Pawn d4 takes e5. Rook h8 to d8. Pawn e5 takes f6, check. King e7 takes f6. Rook e4 takes b4. Rook d8 to d1, check. King g1 to f2. Bishop b3 to c2. Pawn g2 to g4. Rook c6 takes c5. Rook b4 to b6, check. King f6 to e5. King f2 to e2. Rook d1 to h1. King e2 to e3. Rook h1 takes h2. Rook b6 to b8. Rook c5 to d5. Rook b8 to e8, check. King e5 to f6. Rook e8 to f8, check. King f6 to e5. Rook f8 to e8, check. King e5 to f6. Rook e8 to f8, check. King f6 to g5. Rook f8 to g8, check. King g5 to h4. Rook g8 to b8. King h4 to g3. Rook a1 to a3. Rook d5 to d1. Rook a3 to b3. Rook h2 to f2. Pawn a4 to a5. Rook f2 to f3, check. King e3 to e2. Bishop c2 takes b3. Rook b8 takes b3. Rook f3 takes b3. King e2 takes d1. Rook b3 takes b1, check. King d1 to c2. Rook b1 to a1. King c2 to d3. Rook a1 takes a5. King d3 to c3. Rook a5 to g5. King c3 to c4. Rook g5 takes g4, check. King c4 to d5. Pawn h6 to h5. King d5 to a6. Pawn h5 to h4. King e6 to e5. Pawn h4 to h3. King e5 to d5. Pawn h3 to h2. King d5 to a5. Pawn h2 to h1, promoting to queen. King e5 to d6. Queen h1 to h6, check. King d6 to d5. Queen h6 to h5, check. King d5 to c6. Rook g4 to g6, check. King c6 to b7. Queen h5 to h7, check. King b7 to a8. Rook g6 to g8, checkmate.